Merci, Jean-Paul. That was a wonderful introduction to this amazing collection that weaves such a beautiful tapestry through the arts of East Asia. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who also has a very close connection to the Myers, and that's through their collection of Jade. Filippo Salviati is currently lecturer in Korean and Chinese art at the Italian Institute of Oriental Studies, Sapienza University in Rome. His interest in Chinese archaic jades dates back to the 1990s, when he was writing his dissertation at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London under the supervision of Sarah Allen, now professor at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. His expertise in the subject led to the collaboration and friendship with Sam and Myrna Myers, which resulted in the publication of 2 books on their jade collection, The Language of Adornment and Radiant Stones. In addition to the section on jades that he's written for the volume 2 Americans in Paris, which is the catalog for the exhibition, From the Lands of Asia, Filippo has recently authored a major publication on this fascinating topic, entitled 4,000 Years of Chinese Archaic Jades, The Development of Jade Carving Tradition from Neolithic to the Han Dynasty, published by Edition Zach, Vienna in 2017. He also works as an advisor and consultant for collectors, dealers, auction houses, and museums. So would you please join me in welcoming Filippo Salviati.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Jennifer and the wonderful staff of the Kimbell Museum to organize this exhibition and this symposium. And thank you to Sam and Myrna for having put together this absolutely wonderful collection of Asian art that is now ready to be enjoyed publicly in an exhibition that is presenting this year of collecting in the field of Chinese and Asian art in its full scope. And I have to thank also Myrna, because Myrna has been a mentor for throughout this friendship that we have had over the past 20 years or more. And she has always been a person that has inspired not only the side of collecting, but the side of researching. And when we met, our cooperation has been fruitful because there was a common interest by everybody, not just studying the objects, admiring them for their beauty, but Myrna had a kind of scholar approach to all this fascinating world, and so she has been the person with whom I have personally experienced many interesting moments of conversation and sharing knowledge on one of the most fascinating and also difficult topics in Chinese art, which is archaic Chinese jade. Sorry if I'm visibly moved saying this, but I think that Myrna is, as Eric Lee said yesterday, she's overlooking over all this. And this is also something that is an homage to her, multifaceted personality, and that has made one of the best acquaintances in my life in the last years. Anyway, and now this adventure continues with Sam, because Sam is equally a passionate individual collector and has a strong interest in this material that goes beyond the mere acquisition and possession of these objects, because these objects are fascinating in themselves to an extent that I will try to show you in a few minutes, hinting at some of the issues that make the study of archaic jades so intriguing and fascinating. The Chinese character that you see up there on the left of the slide is the Chinese character for jade, yu, and is the same character that you find today in the name of China, Zhongguo. And this is often stressed as an element, a linguistic element that confirms the importance that jade has for the Chinese, since it is a material, an element that it is at the core of Chinese civilization. It is, something that we find when we look at the very beginning of this important civilization. Now, one thing that I have to say, and it is in line with what Jean-Paul said before, is that this collection of Chinese jade is absolutely the most vast in scope nowadays in private hands. It is the largest collection, comprehensive, chronologically, typologically exhaustive, that rivals those that are today visible in some of the major public museums all over the world. And these museums include many here in the United States. And here we see three key figures that may be familiar to some of you, Charles Langfrey, Grenville Winthrop, and Heber Bishop, that have been amongst the greatest pioneers, American collectors that created the first collection of archaic jades that are today visible respectively in Washington in the Freer and Sackler galleries. Winthrop collection is nowadays in the Harvard Museum, and the Bishop collection is actually the first that was created here in the United States, and it is the one that is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I've put Mr. Bishop at the end, although chronologically speaking, he's the oldest. Now, he's the first collector that created the first major collection of Chinese archaic Chinese jades with a strong focus on the archaic ones. But I've put him as last one because, as you see, this is not a photograph, but is a portrait made in jade, which is somewhere in the Metropolitan, because the entire collection of Bishop was exhibited in a special room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then this room was dismantled, but it's really, really, I think, fascinating and interesting that we have the first collector of Chinese jade here in the United States that is now, and we have some, a portrait of him that has been carved in the hardest material. I mean, his portrait will survive for a few millennia while the photographs will disappear. So he had this is an idea, and I would think about that, to have a I think Bishop was, unfortunately, I don't have a color image for that, but because obviously jade is not black and white. Could be, but it's not. Mostly has variations of colors that we will now see in the next slide. Now here we are, the three of us at work. Myrna obviously is overlooking the whole production. We were working here at the first of the publications that we made, in first or second, but the Radiant Stones, we were all much younger, so I will go on. But anyway, you see our working environment, which is basically the house, the lovely house in Paris that Sam and Myrna had, and which for us scholars is the best environment where you can spend a weekend or even 3, 4, 5 days without even going into Paris, because they're surrounded by a beautiful garden and you are surrounded by beautiful things. And so we sit at the table there with piles of books and all the papers and surrounded, as you can see, by jades. This is absolutely fascinating. And this is what, I think the collaboration between scholars and collectors is an old one. And the best collections have always been formed through this cooperation. Even the key figures that we saw before were all helped in building their collections by experts and professionals and academics in the field. Now, here we see 3 different images of the texture of jade. Because before looking at how this material was worked, it's important to see what the material itself looks like. Also because this is one of the reasons for collecting Chinese jades that some, is one of the pillars of his collecting, because the jades, beyond being interested for the carving, the historical value, they need to be physically interesting, because with jade you need to have a physical relationship. Well, it's like with porcelain, you need to touch these objects, and the texture of jade, the polishing, the surface, the smoothness, these are intrinsic physical qualities of the stone that have always been appreciated by the Chinese. So some is choosing the jades also in terms of the physical relationship, and the feeling that they provide you when you handle them. And this is perfectly aligned with the traditional way of approaching this material by the Chinese. Another characteristic of jade is the translucency of the stone. And jade is meant to be seen in sunlight. That's very simple, but there was no electricity before, no? Maybe you can say use candle, but candle were used very, very late in China. So it's a stone that is enhanced. If you want to see its texture, that's why this genius title that Myrna had, Radiant Stones, for the first catalog that we did together, because this is the radiance from within the stone, that it is enhanced once the stone is hit with the dark sunlight. It changes completely, because when the light filters through the stone becomes alive. And this is something that was pivotal, crucial, important for the ancient Chinese, because these objects were made to be mostly worn by the person as ornaments, but also as emblem of status and, occasionally also ritual objects. So this is the physical material that we deal with. And here we have another contrasting image of 2 details, or 2 jades in the exhibition. The one at the center is a small detail of a white jade that was used to carve a number of items of the Liao dynasty. And it is the purest, is jade in its purest form, comes from the Central Asia region of Khotan, which is traditionally the place where this type of jade is mined. This jade is pure because, as you see from the white color, there are no impurities, no minerals, no inclusions, nothing else, so that the crystal structure of the jade, and I took the detail where we have some gold painted in the lines carved on the cup, so you can see the difference. Otherwise, you would just see a white, a white surface. On the contrary, the other jade, which is a detail of one of these early Bronze Age long weapons that we saw before in one of the slides that Jean-Paul used, is the color at the opposite range. This is a type of jade so rich in inclusions that it almost look black, but it's not. And actually, the 2 stones are the same, but with the difference that the dark one is very rich in other minerals that change completely, you know, the natural white color of the jade. And here we have two other of the jades in the exhibition that I've put together to show you this strong contrast between the two, you know, extremities of this spectrum of colors that jade can take, from almost pure white with, you know, some browns areas given by the inclusions, mostly metals and other elements in the stone, and the almost black surface of one of the jung blades that are featured here in the exhibition. Now, I will focus shortly on the very beginning of Chinese civilization so that you get a glimpse of the complexity of the topic and the fascination of this investigation. Because jade was used since the Neolithic period in China, but not by all Neolithic cultures that were living in China. So today we say China, jade, we use very vague terms, that we associate China with jade, but originally this was not the case. Originally there was no China. I mean, in 4,000, 3,000 BC, there were groups of people that lived in what is the massland of China, but not all of them carved jade. And so this is immediately one of the pivotal and crucial points. Do I have a pointer here? Okay, anyway, this is the detail of the map. And you just, if you follow the coastline and you get to the north where you have a Qingdao, that is the Shandong Peninsula, jetting out towards Korea. Okay, if you go beyond that, and you are in that gulf in northeast China, so that is one area where in a chronological frame that goes from 5,000 to 2,000 BC, developed some important regional cultures, of which Hongshan, featured in the exhibition, is one of these. The other area that we'll see is the area much farther south, where you have the city of Shanghai, Hangzhou, near the coast, and where the other major jade-using culture has been discovered and thoroughly excavated, particularly in the last 20 years. So there are other areas in China where jade was used, but primarily are the cultures that were located along the eastern side of China that used jade. And this is very important because the other cultures did other things. And the Chinese civilization is supposed to have developed mostly in central China, in the area where we have the city of Xi'an, which used to be one of the old capitals for centuries in China. But there, the evidence of jade is almost non-existent compared to the vast use that the Neolithic cultures located on the east coast made of this stone. So let's see some of them. Here we are in the northeast part of China, and these are photographs showing archaeological sites of the Hongshan culture that in its late stage flourished between 3000 and 2000 BC, or roughly more like the Liangzhu culture that we see after. Now, the important thing of this of the Hongshan culture is that the tombs where jade have been found, and that you see the two on the right, are always located in the proximity of what are described as ceremonial centers. And with a complex ritual architecture, and we have a glimpse of this architecture there in the two pictures on the left, you see on the top the square altar that you see on the bottom slide, slightly on the side. So it's a real picture, the one on the bottom, and a detail of this ritual structure right at the top. The tombs of, it's interesting because you see that the structure, when you see on plan, they have a square and a round shape. And this is incredibly important because these two shapes are to play a pivotal role in the definition of ancient Chinese cosmology. And we will find them much later on, for example, in the Temple of Heaven, built during the Ming period, which is now one of the main touristic attractions when you visit Beijing. The people that, so the tombs that are associated to these ritual centers are all excavated and constructed around these places. And the only items that we find in these graves are jade, nothing else. And we are also lucky because this is an area where skeletons survive much easier than in the south. So we can even glimpse at these people and see how these jades were actually worn when they were alive. And if these people were buried only with jade, no pottery, nothing else, it means that they were buried with a kind of, ritual paraphernalia and so that they are considered logically by archaeologists as being some of the leading figures of this ancient society that were probably buried in the vicinity, in the proximity of these ritual centers that probably acted as seasonal centers for some sort of ritual activities for these communities. By looking at the tombs, we can recognize various typologies of jades that we will see in the exhibition. I thought this is interesting because in most cases when we see these objects in museums, in exhibitions like this, we see them isolated from their original context. Okay, now here we have a detail of one of these skeletons where you can see that on the chest area there are two of these very curiously looking jades that are called pig dragons by the Chinese because they have a face resembling that of a pig and the body of a dragon-like creature. And they were used as pendants, and in this case the person had two. So two of these big pig dragons hanging here on the chest like that. And then behind the skull there is one of these tubular ornaments in jade that were probably used as a hair ornament, so that the hair went through the tube and then went down, or in other possible fashions. So that, you have to imagine these people when standing, with this that looked like a crown, and these two huge, jades in the form of this mythical animal, plus other items. So these people might have looked very, impressive when they were completely dressed with this ritual jade. On the left, we have a more evolved shape of this pig dragon. Is basically the same as before. It's this C-shaped animals, you see. But this example is much fatter, while this one is much more elegant. And it is one of the rarest pieces in the Myers collection because the jade is, Myers jade is on the left. No? The one on the right is the only excavated example that we know of. And it was found somewhere in Inner Mongolia, and it is now housed in Beijing in the Historical Museum. One important thing, one important work that I do when I work on collections of jade, I try to trace back to the specific place where a certain type of jade can be found in the archaeological records, because in this way you can relate items which are unprovenance, because they were bought over the market. That jade, for example, on the left, comes from an old German collection, and it was collected at the time, probably around 30s or 40s, so more or less at the time that the American collectors were collecting jade and building up the first major collections of jade here in the United States. So most of these jades have been circulating for a long time and ended up, there's another example in the Musée Guimet in Paris, that it is of such an early date in terms of collecting. So now, with the body of evidence provided by the archaeological excavations, we are in a much better position to identify the site where these jades were originally worked at and by which cultures. This doesn't help much in understanding what was the actual meaning of this jade. And there is a lot of speculation because we simply do not have any record. What we have are these archaeological structures, the tombs, the jades, and we have to reconstruct the life and the importance of jade in the life of these people merely through the archaeological records. And sometimes, like in the case of the Hongshan cultures, these sites are spread over a huge geographical area. So we are, even if we know of all these Neolithic cultures since at least the beginning of the 20th century, we are still at a very infant stage of our understanding of these cultures. And remember, we are looking at the roots of Chinese civilization. We are looking at people that actually laid out the foundation for aspects of Chinese culture that we'll find later on in imperial times. And I'm presenting you this detail of one of the cups in the exhibition because this very graceful and wonderfully worked dragon in profile, dragon with a very strong feline features that was carved in the Han period, is actually the descendant of these earlier forms of dragon. In fact, these jades, this type of jades, are considered by the Chinese to be actually one of the earliest representation of the Chinese dragon in China as a whole. We don't know if that is the case, but it definitely looks like a curious animal, especially with this long mane, the body, the serpentine body, features that later on will be found in dragons. And this, let's say, that is at a chronological end of this tradition of jade carving in the Han period. So these are the two dragons that more or less define the use of jade in ancient China. Another interesting aspect of this culture, the Hongshan culture, is that we have some of these ritual structures, like in this case, the one that you see excavated on the left, where archaeologists have found evidence of human sculptures modeled in clay. And this one on the right is one of the most impressive. More have been found recently, so that we are getting a better picture. But definitely these were sort of statues and sculptures that were put in specific ritual temples. And this is in fact called the temple of the goddess, and it is considered to be one of the main ritual centers of the Hongshan culture. Now, a link with the south and with the Liangzhu culture, which is the other major jade-using culture of the Neolithic period, is provided here in this slide, where we have on the top one typical Hongshan jade carved in a comb-like pattern with an abstract face right in the middle. And I've put that to show that this sense of face, of representing what probably were considered as deities and so on, is crucial in this early period of Chinese culture. So we have an actual physical representation of the divinities or the gods that were pivotal in the cult of these people. So the jade carved with the mask is related to the pottery figure in the sense that there is this sense of depicting a mask here is much more evocative because you see you have the cards depicting the eyes and the rows of protrusions at the bottom that look like a series of teeth. So kind of menacing mask. Interesting, the other jade using culture that we find in the south near the Shanghai area, Liangzhu, has the mask motif as one of the main decorative pattern carved on its jade. Here we have, again, the map showing the geographical location. We have moved farther south. We are now in the Shanghai area, more or less, and it is here where the Liangzhu culture developed. Recently, the archaeologists have discovered a huge proto-urban site, which is considered the largest Neolithic settlement, urban settlement in ancient China. And it has been discovered near the city of Hangzhou, so that the people that made use of these jade objects were, actually very powerful rulers over a part of China that is now in southern near the coast. One of this culture is responsible for the creation of one of the most enigmatic shapes in jades, which is the zong. And here we see an evocative picture of the various possibilities offered by this shape, which is basically a cylinder with a square outer appearance and an inner cylindrical core. And the outside is carved with very accurate registers decorated with stylized masks. Now, here in this picture, not all the jades that you see are decorated with these masks. Some of these zong are plain, as you can see, because the plain ones were actually made by cultures that chronologically followed Liangzhu. So the plain ones are actually inspired by the carved cylinders that are always and invariably decorated with masks. In the exhibition, there is on display a beautiful example, because these cylinders could be of various sizes, and here we have the tallest one in the exhibition with the detail of these masks carved at the corners. I just said that these are stylized masks. So the full rendering of this mask, we know through specimens collected in a number of archaeological sites, and it is absolutely fascinating because it is the most known Chinese thing that you would expect to find in China, this one. This is the complex version of this simplified mask. And if I were not said that this is a motif carved on objects found in China, you would probably naturally feel that it has a kind of Mesoamerican feeling, because you have this figure represented frontally, standing over an animal, with the arms open like that, but particularly you have this figure that has a very large feathered headdress on its head. This is absolutely a non-Chinese thing. We will never see this image again in China. Feathered headdresses are kind of an ethnic, trait that we find in southern China here and there, and is linked to the use of feathers in a much broader area that goes through the Southeast Asia down to the islands of the Pacific. But this is a really amazing image because at the core of Chinese civilization, we find something that it is not Chinese. And in terms that it is, it will be forgotten by what is to become China later, this sort of image. Not the shape of the object. The object will somehow remain. They will speculate that the shape is a combination of the circle and square, and the circle and square we've seen in the ritual structures of the Hongshan are associated with probably heaven and earth-related cults. But this image is really amazing. Oh, by the way, although you see it very, very big, in reality it's only 2 centimeters high. This big. Okay? And this gives you an extraordinary also idea of the capacity of the Chinese carvers. This image is in 2 levels. You have an engraved background, and then you have this face sticking out in relief, the human and the animal mask face. So this is, just to provide you with a glimpse of the complexity of this culture, which produced also another enigmatic shape, which is the B disc that is exhibited in an exhibition. Again, this is a group of discs that were made from a period that goes from 3000 BC to 2000 or even 1800 BC. So they cover a full range, and few of them are of the Liangzhu culture, the others were made by cultures that imitated them. And here we have 2 burials that gives you these 2 tombs that gives you a perfect idea of what one may expect to find in these burials. These people, like the people in the north, were almost exclusively buried with jades in huge quantities. The tomb on the left has something like maybe is more than 35 of these long cylinders, plus a number of discs, so that very often the total number of jade items in these tombs goes over 200, in some cases even 300, if you count even these very small beads that were used to make necklaces. Here we have another tomb where we see how that these beads were very often, the head would be at the top of the slide, and near the feet of the deceased, very often, these bead discs were piled in quantities, like if it was not currency, wasn't the big coin of the period, I think, but maybe was, an emblem of status, and the more you had of them, and the more important you looked in this society that I do not want to term primitive. There's nothing primitive. Primitive is our understanding of these people. Also because these cultures, and this is the very interesting aspect of this story, they just disappeared from China. Because in the south, probably that was due to climate changes, so that the entire region was flooded. We have in the Chinese traditional myth, the myth of flood, and it occurs in that part of China. So probably as a consequence of a heavy rains and flooding, the ecosystem is based on intensive rice agriculture there. So it can be destroyed by, as we see, by weather, that extreme manifestations of weather conditions. And this is a possibility because when the archaeologists excavate these sites, they do not find a sequence after these layers where these tombs are, because these sites were occupied much later on, centuries later, in some cases, meaning that these areas, after the people that developed these cultures, were then dishabited for a while before then being again reused. And today this is the granary of China, because this part of the country produces up to 3 harvests of rice and other crops in a year. So it is a very important and crucial area. So the mystery of these jades remain, but the archaeological discoveries are just amazing. This tomb that you see there is another example of how lavishly was the use of jade. It is a culture that is in the area of southern China, but has been found near the city of Nanjing, slightly upper north, compared to the Liangzhu area. And here we see that the burials that have been excavated there, again, all these tombs, also in the case of the Liangzhu culture, are often associated to raised platforms, altar-like structures, so ceremonial centers. So like in the case of the Hongshan, these people were buried in the proximity of the ritual centers. And here again, we have a comparison of 3 axes in the Samen a Myrna collection of Chinese jades presented in the exhibition, and what you have there when you open one of these amazing tombs. Later on, Jade continued, the cultures that came after this very early beginning very often got inspiration from these very early jades to craft their own jades. There we have a disc made in a number of sections that it is clearly in imitation of this ancient disc, but that was made by a culture that flourished in a completely different area, almost in northwest China. But this culture was influenced by this shape. What the bee disc and these cylinders survived the Liangzhu culture. And the people, the other Chinese that found these jades, found them as mysterious as we consider them to be nowadays. So the first to speculate about the possible function of these jades have been the Chinese. And all the ideas that for centuries have been transmitted about these jades and then inherited by Western scholarship right at the beginning when jade was collected through the key figures that we saw before, these concepts have survived until now when the new possibilities offered by the archaeological discoveries are challenging our understanding and very often simplistic explanations of these objects, because the quantity of these finds and the complexity of these cultures is beyond any possible idea that we could have before. Here on the left, on the right, you have a further elaboration of this disc that took place during the Han Dynasty. While the original discs were all plain, in the Han Dynasty they become very ornate, as most of the Han Dynasty jades are, so that the surface is covered by these small raised curls, and very often very elegant birds, like this one, in this case, in the carved around the objects. Now, this jade here on the right is not part of the exhibition. Let me say that what you see in this context, from the Lens of Asia exhibition, is a very good selection, very ample selection of what some Myrna have been collecting over the years. But it does not represent the whole. I mean, every exhibition is a selection. And Jean-Paul has done a wonderful and very difficult job to select the best pieces and the highlights of this collection. So this just to say that we are still working, Sam and I still sitting at the same table with Myrna overlooking us, because this adventure is still going on. Thank you.